Greetings. My name is Ozzie Hall, and I released a new book today called Black America's Identity Crisis. I wrote the book after talking with several young people and having a discussion where they were explaining to me, one individual explained to me that I'm a Black American who's a descendant of Moroccans, and that I'm a Moorish American. I had another brother later in the day that I was talking to tried to explain to me that I was a Black Hebrew. And then I was speaking with another brother, and he was explaining to me that I'm a Black Asiatic. And I began to just think about the level of confusion that exists in the Black community over the issue of identity. And I realized that this identity crisis has an origin. It goes back to the transatlantic slave trade, when over 200 separate and distinct African ethnic groups were taken from Africa. About 95% of the enslaved Africans were taken from the west coast of Africa. And the research shows that a little bit less than 5% were taken from the east coast of Africa in the transatlantic slave trade. Now, this is not talking about the Arab slave trade, which also Arabs took about 9 million Black people from East Africa. So that's a separate discussion. But the Africans who were taken from Africa and brought to the Americas by the Portuguese, the British, the Spaniards, the Dutch, the French, and various other European groups were taken to 79 slave ports. And there were over 200 separate and distinct African ethnic groups, from the Mandinka to the Akan to the Ashanti to the Malinke to the Jollof to the Igbo, Hausa, and Yoruba, and many, many other African distinct African ethnic groups with their own histories and culture. So this group of people being taken, this is the origin of our identity crisis that exists in the Black community. The fact that we were taken from so many places and we were brought to the Americas, where we mixed in together, and none of those distinct groups remained. We became an amalgamation of all of these groups. And we can actually discover various cultural elements that were passed down and transmitted from generation to generation pretty much unconsciously. And the fact of the matter is that there was a period of nearly 500 years that this process occurred. And during that time, it was illegal for us to learn to read and write and to gain information that would enable us to understand our actual true identity. So once Black people became free after the end of the Civil War in America, and the 13th and 14th Amendments were adopted, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, and the 14th Amendment conferring a citizenship upon Black Americans, we immediately began to go into a search for identity. We called ourselves Ethiopians. We called ourselves Africans. We called ourselves Negroes. We called ourselves Black. We called ourselves African American. And we had a number of groups come forward and teach us that we were Black Moors, or that we were Black Jews, that we were Black Muslims, that we were Asiatic Blacks, that we were. It was a host of different identities that we were given. And it's almost like going to shop in a store and there's a whole bunch of coats on the rack, and you go in and you try on a coat and see how it looks and how it fits and how it feels. And some coats, you'd buy it and you might wear that coat for years. So Black people went through this search for identity in trying to discover who they are. And they've gone through a bunch of different false identities. And the reality is that many of us are still wearing these false identities. And, we connect to a group that gives us identity. And so we wear that coat. But to discover our true identity, the key is for us to actually understand what happened, to go back in history and to examine what happened and to examine our origins. And when we begin to do that, we see that we come from over 200 separate and distinct African ethnic groups that were merged together and thrown into one kind of melting pot within the Americas through the process of slavery. And through this fire that we went through, this trial and tribulation that we went through, we emerged as a separate and distinct group of Black people. And so we should be able to take pride in being the descendants of enslaved Africans. And there's no shame in not being able to say, well, my nationality is I'm a Moor, or I come from I'm an Asiatic Black man. Because when we began to test that information, we find that, for example, the Black people that were taken into slavery had no connection to the Middle East. There's no evidence showing that there were Asiatic Black men who migrated and ended up in West Africa and were taken into slavery. That the Black people taken into slavery, we were from African people. And so when we began to examine the facts, all of these different stories fall apart. We say we're a Black Hebrew, but then if you look at the history of the Hebrews and the history of Black Americans, what you find is that there's no physical evidence that would support the belief. There might be a handful of people that at one point may have been remotely connected. So again, the discovery of our Black identity is inherent in us studying Black history and becoming knowledgeable about our history. That is the key to discovering ourselves. Everything else is just a coat that we put on along the way.